There is a temple that exists in the mind of every seeker. Its walls are made of light, its floors polished to perfect reflection. Those who enter believe they are ascending toward truth, toward enlightenment, toward the dissolution of all suffering. They speak in soft voices about consciousness and compassion. They meditate for hours. They renounce desire, declare themselves awakened, post their realizations on digital altars for others to witness. They have found the path, or so they believe. But here is what they do not see. Beneath every temple of light, there is a basement, and in that basement, something breathes in the darkness, growing stronger with every denial, every spiritual affirmation, every declaration of transcendence. It feeds on what has been cast down, on what has been judged unworthy of the light. It is the shadow side of spirituality itself, the unconscious underbelly of our quest for the divine. Tonight we descend into that basement together. This is not a journey for the faint of heart, nor is it a betrayal of the spiritual path. Rather, it is its completion, because the most dangerous thing a human being can do is pursue enlightenment without first understanding what they are trying to transcend. The most treacherous temple is the one built on a foundation of repression, where seekers smile with perfect serenity, while their shadows grow monstrous beneath them, unseen but never unfelt. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Yet how many spiritual movements, how many teachers, how many earnest seekers have built their entire practice on the opposite premise? That enlightenment means escaping the darkness entirely, transcending it, rising above it like a balloon released from the gravity of the human condition. This is the great illusion. This is the shadow side of spirituality. Consider this paradox. The more desperately we pursue the light, the darker our shadow becomes. The higher we try to ascend, the deeper the basement extends beneath us. Every quality we claim to have transcended, anger, desire, ego, judgment, does not disappear, but descends into the unconscious, where it takes on new forms, more insidious, because they wear the mask of holiness. Have you ever noticed how the most spiritual people can sometimes be the cruelest? How communities built on love and acceptance can become the most judgmental? How gurus who speak of egolessness can exhibit the most stunning narcissism? How those who claim to have conquered desire can be the most manipulative in obtaining what they want? This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is something far more complex and far more human. It is the inevitable consequence of a spirituality that seeks heaven without first mapping hell, that reaches for transcendence without integrating the darkness, that builds temples without foundations. The question we must ask tonight is not whether spirituality is valuable. It is profoundly valuable. The question is, what happens when our spiritual seeking itself becomes a form of shadow work in reverse? When our quest for light becomes a sophisticated mechanism for avoiding our own darkness? Spiritual bypassing, toxic positivity, enlightened narcissism, premature transcendence. These are not aberrations in the spiritual path. They are its shadow, as inevitable as the shadow cast by any object in the sun. And until we understand this, until we descend into the basement beneath our temples, we will continue to mistake repression for transcendence, avoidance for awakening, and spiritual performance for genuine transformation. Tonight, we will trace this shadow from its origins in the deepest structures of the human psyche, through its manifestation in spiritual communities and practices, to its ultimate resolution, not through more light, but through the courageous act of turning toward the darkness we have tried so hard to escape. We will meet the spiritual ego, that part of us that wears enlightenment like armor. We will encounter the shadow of the seeker, the repressed aspects of self that grow stronger the more we try to be spiritual. We will explore how the very language of spirituality, non-attachment, letting go, unconditional love, can become weapons of self-violence, tools of a sophisticated inner tyranny that is all the more dangerous because it disguises itself as wisdom. And we will discover something that few spiritual teachers are willing to acknowledge. that the path to genuine awakening does not bypass the shadow, but leads directly through it. That true enlightenment is not the absence of darkness, but the full integration of it. That the only way out is through, and the only way up is first down. This is the descent into the shadow side of spirituality. This is the journey beneath the temple of light, into the places where our repressed humanity waits, patient and powerful, for the moment when we are finally ready to meet it without judgment, without fear, without the need to immediately transform it into something more palatable to our spiritual self-image. Because here is the secret that ancient wisdom traditions understood, but modern spirituality has forgotten. The divine is not only in the light. God is not only in heaven. The sacred is not only in transcendence. There is a dark divinity, a sacred shadow, a holy descent that is as much a part of the spiritual path as any ascension. The mystics knew this. The alchemists knew this. Jung knew this. They spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary descent into matter and shadow before any true transformation could occur. They understood that gold is found in darkness, that the pearl forms around an irritant, that the lotus grows from mud. But somewhere along the way, particularly in modern Western spirituality, we lost this wisdom. We created a spirituality of light without darkness, of ascension without descent, of transcendence without integration. We built temples without basements, and now the basements are full. The shadows have grown monstrous, and the time has come to descend. So I ask you now, before we begin this journey together, are you willing to meet what you have cast into the basement of your spiritual life? Are you willing to see the ways your own pursuit of enlightenment may have become a refined form of self-rejection? Are you ready to discover that the very qualities you have tried hardest to transcend may be the keys to your genuine liberation? If you are, then let us descend together. Let us walk down the stairs beneath the temple, into the darkness where our shadows wait, not to destroy them, not to transform them prematurely into light, but simply to see them, to acknowledge them, to integrate them into a more complete and honest understanding of what it means to be a conscious human being walking a spiritual path. This is Season 3, The Descent into Shadow. This is the shadow side of spirituality, and this is where the real work begins. To understand the shadow side of spirituality, we must first understand how shadows are created. And in the architecture of the human psyche, every shadow begins with a division, a splitting of the world into acceptable and unacceptable, spiritual and unspiritual, light and dark. This division is not inherently wrong. It is, in fact, necessary. A child must learn to distinguish between behaviors that create connection and those that create conflict. Every culture must establish boundaries, values, systems of meaning. The problem arises not from the division itself, but from what happens to the rejected half. Sigmund Freud, the great cartographer of the unconscious, understood this with clinical precision. He described the process of repression, how the psyche takes thoughts, feelings, and desires that are incompatible with our conscious self-image and pushes them down into the unconscious, where they do not disappear, but continue to exert influence in disguised forms. But it was Carl Jung who took this understanding deeper, who saw that what we repress does not simply vanish into a psychological void. Instead, it accumulates. It organizes, it develops a kind of autonomous intelligence. Jung called this the shadow, the repository of everything we have deemed unacceptable about ourselves, everything we have judged as too dark, too dangerous, too human to integrate into our conscious identity. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Notice the paradox. The more we try to be pure, the more contaminated our shadow becomes. The more we try to be only light, the more monstrous our darkness grows. Now, let us bring this into the realm of spirituality. Imagine a young seeker, earnest and wounded, who discovers meditation, yoga, or a spiritual teacher who promises that suffering can end, that the ego can be transcended, that peace is possible. This discovery feels like salvation. Finally, a path away from the pain of being human. Finally, a methodology for becoming something better, higher, purer. The seeker begins to practice. They meditate daily. They read sacred texts. They adopt spiritual language and values. They become, in their own eyes and in the eyes of their community, a spiritual person. But here is what happens beneath the surface. Every time they feel anger, they judge it as unspiritual and push it down. Every time they experience sexual desire, they see it as an obstacle to transcendence and repress it. Every time their ego asserts itself, they shame it into silence. Every time they feel jealousy, competitiveness, or judgment, they immediately overlay it with spiritual concepts, non-attachment, compassion, letting go, without actually processing the emotion itself. What they are doing, without realizing it, is not transcending these aspects of their humanity, but creating a spiritual shadow, a vast repository of rejected human experiences that now exist in the darkness beneath their spiritual identity. And here is where it becomes dangerous. This spiritual shadow does not simply lie dormant. It becomes active. It influences behavior in ways the seeker cannot consciously recognize. The repressed anger emerges as passive aggression disguised as maintaining boundaries. The repressed sexuality manifests as inappropriate relationships with students or community members, rationalized through spiritual language. The repressed ego inflates into a sense of spiritual superiority. I am more evolved, more conscious, more awakened than those who have not found the path. This is not a betrayal of spirituality. This is spirituality's shadow, and it is as inevitable as gravity. Let me tell you a story, not of a single person, but of a pattern that repeats across cultures and centuries. In ancient Greece, there were the Orphic mysteries, communities of seekers who pursued purification through ascetic practices. They believed the body was a prison, the material world a corruption, and that through discipline and devotion, they could achieve apotheosis, becoming like the gods. Yet historical accounts reveal that these communities often fractured through power struggles, sexual scandals, and bitter conflicts between members who claimed superior levels of purification. The very pursuit of becoming divine created new forms of very human darkness. Fast forward to medieval Christianity. Monasteries and convents, places dedicated to transcending worldly desires, became in many cases hotbeds of repressed sexuality, violent punishment, and psychological torture, all in the name of purification. The more extreme the denial of the body and its needs, the more twisted the shadow became. Flagellation, extreme fasting, sexual abuse disguised as spiritual testing. These were not aberrations, but the shadow side of a spirituality built on the rejection of human nature. In the East, similar patterns emerged. Buddhist monasteries, despite teachings of compassion and non-attachment, developed rigid hierarchies, cult-like devotion to teachers, and systems of psychological manipulation. Zen masters who claimed egolessness exhibited stunning levels of narcissism and cruelty. Yogis who preached celibacy secretly maintained harems. Not all teachers, of course, but enough to reveal a pattern, a shadow that grows in proportion to the light we claim to embody. And now, in our modern era, we see it everywhere. The wellness influencer who preaches self-love while displaying textbook narcissism. The meditation teacher arrested for financial fraud. The yoga guru exposed for sexual exploitation. The spiritual community that claims to be built on acceptance, but operates through subtle mechanisms of judgment and exclusion. The seeker who has done so much inner work, but remains deeply wounded, using spiritual language to avoid genuine psychological healing. These are not failures of individuals. These are symptoms of a deeper problem, a fundamental misunderstanding of what spirituality is and what it requires of us. Here is the misunderstanding. We have come to believe that spirituality means becoming someone else someone better, someone without the messy, contradictory, dark aspects of human nature. We have confused spiritual growth with the creation of an ideal self, a self that is always calm, always compassionate, always radiating light. But this ideal self is not real. It is a construct. And like all constructs built on repression, it requires constant maintenance. The spiritual practitioner must constantly police their inner experience, judging each thought and feeling against the standard of their spiritual ideal. Am I being too attached? Am I being judgmental? Am I coming from ego? This creates not freedom, but a new form of psychological imprisonment, a spiritual superego that is as tyrannical as any external authority. Psychologist John Welwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe this phenomenon, the use of spiritual practices and beliefs to avoid dealing with painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. It is the attempt to jump straight to transcendence without first doing the horizontal work of psychological integration. Spiritual bypassing can take many forms, the use of meditation to numb painful emotions rather than to develop awareness of them. The appeal to everything happens for a reason, to avoid grieving genuine losses. The claim that it's all an illusion, to dismiss valid concerns about injustice or harm. The insistence on forgiveness and letting go before anger and hurt have been fully acknowledged and processed. The belief that if you just think positively enough, manifest consciously enough, raise your vibration enough, you can avoid life's inevitable difficulties. All of these are ways of using spiritual concepts to create distance from our actual human experience. And every time we do this, we feed the shadow. Every emotion we judge as unspiritual. Every need we dismiss as unenlightened. Every aspect of ourselves we try to transcend prematurely. All of this goes into the basement, where it ferments and grows, where it develops its own power, where it waits. Because here is what the shadow side of spirituality reveals. The unconscious cannot be transcended. It can only be integrated. Any attempt to rise above it without first moving through it will fail. The basement will call us back down again and again through symptoms we cannot ignore, through relationship conflicts, through compulsive behaviors, through sudden breakthroughs of rage or desire that shatter our carefully constructed spiritual image. Jung understood this deeply. He wrote, "There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection, but for completeness, and for this, the thorn in the flesh is needed, the suffering of defects without which there is no progress and no ascent." Notice that word, completeness, not perfection. This is the key. True spiritual maturity is not about becoming a perfect being of light. It is about becoming complete, about integrating all aspects of ourselves, including the difficult, dark, and messy ones, into a conscious whole. But to do this, we must first understand how the spiritual shadow forms, how it operates, how it disguises itself as virtue while secretly running the show. We must trace its origins not just in individual psychology, but in the collective structures of spiritual communities and movements. Consider the dynamics of any spiritual community. There are explicit values, compassion, non-judgment, acceptance, growth. But beneath these, there are implicit rules that govern who is truly accepted, who is considered advanced, who gets closer to the teacher, who wields influence. And inevitably, these implicit rules reward those who best perform the role of spiritual person, who speak the language most fluently, who display the most appropriate emotions, who embody the community's ideal. This creates a terrible pressure. To be accepted, to be seen as spiritually mature, one must hide any aspects of oneself that don't fit the ideal. The community becomes a mirror that reflects back only what it wants to see. And so the individual splits. There is the spiritual self that is shown to the community, and there is the shadow self that must be kept hidden. The danger multiplies when this dynamic extends to the relationship between student and teacher. If the teacher has not done their own shadow work, if they have their own unintegrated aspects, they will unconsciously recreate the same patterns they claim to have transcended. The power dynamic of the teacher-student relationship can become a perfect breeding ground for the shadow, for the teacher's unacknowledged need for admiration, control, or sexual gratification, and for the student's unacknowledged need for a parent figure, for certainty, for someone to tell them they are special, chosen, advanced. Many of the most publicized spiritual scandals follow this pattern. A teacher genuinely has some level of insight or realization. Students are drawn to this. The teacher is placed on a pedestal. The teacher begins to believe their own mythology. Their shadow, never fully integrated, begins to exert influence. Inappropriate relationships develop. Financial impropriety occurs. Psychological manipulation becomes normalized. When it all comes to light, there is shock and betrayal. But what is really being revealed is not the hypocrisy of one teacher, but the shadow side of a spiritual system that never required the shadow work in the first place. And here is perhaps the most difficult truth. We cannot simply blame the teachers, because every student who joins such a community brings their own shadow, their own unacknowledged needs, their own unexamined projections, their own desire to bypass the difficult work of psychological growth through the promise of spiritual transcendence. There is a collective shadow in spirituality, a shared blindness to the ways our very pursuit of enlightenment can become a sophisticated form of darkness. So what are the origins of this shadow? They are multiple and interconnected. First, there is the human tendency toward dissociation, the attempt to solve inner conflict by splitting off parts of ourselves rather than integrating them. Spirituality, with its promise of transcendence, can become a tool for this dissociation, a way to conceptually rise above our problems without actually resolving them. Second, there is the wound of unworthiness that many seekers carry. We come to spirituality feeling broken, feeling that there is something fundamentally wrong with us that needs to be fixed. Spiritual practice then becomes a project of self-improvement, of becoming acceptable, of finally being good enough. But this project is built on self-rejection, and self-rejection always creates shadow. Third, there is the influence of cultural narratives about perfection, purity, and progress. Many modern spiritual movements, particularly in the West, are deeply infected with the same ideologies that drive consumer capitalism. The idea that we should always be optimizing, improving, becoming the best version of ourselves. This is simply the ego in spiritual clothing, and it creates an endless hamster wheel of seeking that can never reach satisfaction. Fourth, there is the lack of genuine psychological understanding in many spiritual traditions. Traditional spiritualities developed in cultural contexts very different from our own, often without the insights of modern psychology. When these traditions are transplanted into the modern West without adaptation, they can fail to address the specific psychological needs and wounds of contemporary seekers. The result is a spirituality that deals with transcendent states but not with trauma, that offers maps of consciousness but not tools for emotional processing, that promises enlightenment but not healing. All of these factors combine to create the conditions for the shadow side of spirituality to flourish. And once established, this shadow operates through several key mechanisms, which we must now explore as we descend deeper into our investigation. The first mechanism is projection. Jung taught that we project our shadow. We see in others what we cannot see in ourselves. In spiritual communities, this creates bizarre dynamics where the most judgmental people accuse others of being judgmental, where those most attached to their spiritual identity accuse others of being attached to ego, where those who have repressed their sexuality the most harshly are the most vigilant in policing others' sexual expression. The second mechanism is inflation. When we repress the shadow, the ego inflates to compensate. The spiritual practitioner begins to feel special, chosen, more evolved than others. They may not say this explicitly. In fact, they will likely speak with great humility about their insignificance. But beneath the words, there is a subtle sense of superiority, a belief that they have access to truths that others do not, that they are further along the path. that they are, even as they claim egolessness, remarkably special. The third mechanism is spiritual materialism, a term coined by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. This is the tendency to collect spiritual experiences, practices, and identities in the same way one might collect material possessions, as markers of status, as proof of advancement, as shields against the underlying sense of inadequacy. The spiritual path becomes not a genuine journey toward truth, but a project of building a more sophisticated ego structure, one that is immune to ordinary criticism because it speaks the language of enlightenment. These mechanisms ensure that the shadow side of spirituality perpetuates itself, even, perhaps especially, among those who believe they have transcended their shadows. It is a self-sealing system, because any criticism can be dismissed as coming from those who don't understand, who aren't evolved enough, who are still caught in ego. And so the temples rise higher, more beautiful, more radiant with light, and the basements extend deeper, darker, more filled with what has been cast down and forgotten, until inevitably the foundation cracks, until the repressed erupts, until the shadow can no longer be denied. Which brings us to the crisis point, the moment of descent, the conflict that can no longer be avoided. This is where our journey now takes us, into the heart of the shadow's power, into the moment when spirituality confronts its own darkness and must choose: will it continue to build temples on sand, or will it finally do the work of foundation, the work of descent, the work of integration? There comes a moment in every seeker's journey when the temple cracks. It might be sudden, a scandal, a betrayal, a teacher revealed to be all too human. Or it might be gradual, a growing sense of emptiness despite years of practice, a nagging awareness that beneath the spiritual persona, nothing has fundamentally changed. This is the crisis of the shadow's return, and it is the most dangerous and most sacred moment on the spiritual path. Let me tell you about the dark night. Not the mystical dark night that spiritual literature romanticizes, but the psychological dark night that occurs when the shadow side of our spirituality can no longer be denied. You have been meditating for years. You have studied the texts. You have cultivated what you believed was genuine awareness. You speak the language of consciousness fluently. Your friends consider you wise. You consider yourself on the path. And then, one day, you find yourself in a rage so intense it terrifies you. Or you discover you have been manipulating someone you claim to love. Or you realize that your spiritual practice has been an elaborate mechanism for avoiding life rather than engaging with it. Or you see, with sudden horrifying clarity, that the person you have become in your quest for enlightenment is not more genuine, but less. A performance, a construct, a mask that has become so comfortable you forgot you were wearing it. This moment is unbearable. Everything you have built your identity upon suddenly feels hollow. The spiritual framework that once provided meaning now feels like a cage. The teacher you trusted reveals themselves to be unconscious in precisely the ways they claimed to have transcended. The community that felt like home turns out to be a collective delusion, a mutual agreement to avoid certain truths, to maintain certain illusions, to keep the shadow in the basement where it belongs. What do you do in this moment? There are essentially three responses, three paths that diverge in the dark wood of spiritual crisis. The first path is denial and doubling down. This is the response of those who cannot tolerate the collapse of their spiritual identity. They retreat further into their practice, their beliefs, their community. They become more rigid, more fundamentalist, more certain. If doubt arises, they push it down. If the shadow appears, they banish it with renewed vigor. They may leave one spiritual community only to immediately join another, never allowing the gap, the uncertainty, the groundlessness that is necessary for genuine transformation. They add more practices, more techniques, more layers of spiritual identity, building the walls higher even as the foundation continues to crumble beneath them. This path leads to spiritual rigidity, to the creation of true believers who are the most dangerous kind, those whose entire psychological structure depends on the maintenance of the spiritual narrative, who cannot afford doubt because doubt would mean annihilation of the self they have worked so hard to construct. The second path is disillusionment and rejection. This is the response of those who feel betrayed by spirituality itself. They become cynics. They declare the entire enterprise a sham. Meditation is just self-hypnosis. Enlightenment is a myth. Teachers are all charlatans. Seekers are all deluded. They swing from the extreme of spiritual idealism to the extreme of materialist cynicism, never finding the middle ground. Often these are former true believers who, upon discovering the shadow side, cannot integrate the complexity, cannot hold that something can be both valuable and dangerous, both true and false, both light and shadow. And so they reject it entirely, burning down the temple and declaring themselves free, never recognizing that this rejection is itself another form of avoidance, another way of refusing to do the difficult work of integration. But there is a third path, and it is the one that requires the most courage. It is the path of descent. It is the willingness to go down into the basement, to turn toward the shadow, to meet what has been rejected, not with the goal of destroying it or transcending it, but simply of seeing it, acknowledging it, integrating it into a more complete understanding of what we are. This is the path of genuine transformation, and it is the one least traveled because it offers no immediate comfort. It requires us to hold paradox, to acknowledge that our spiritual practice has been both genuine and defensive, that our teachers have been both wise and unconscious, that our own realizations have been both true and incomplete. It requires us to give up the simplicity of the spiritual narrative we have been living and enter into the complexity of actual psychological and spiritual maturity. Let me describe what this descent looks like, not in abstract terms, but in the lived experience of someone walking this path. You begin by admitting what you have been avoiding, not spiritually, not with detachment or mindfulness or witnessing awareness, but humanly, with all the pain and shame and fear that admission brings. You admit that your meditation practice has often been a way to numb yourself rather than to wake up. You admit that your spiritual language has been a tool for maintaining distance from people, for feeling superior, for avoiding genuine intimacy. You admit that your pursuit of non-attachment has been a sophisticated form of attachment to the identity of being unattached. You admit that beneath your claims of having processed your trauma, your childhood wounds remain raw and active, influencing every relationship, every choice, every supposedly spiritual insight. You admit that you have used spirituality as a shield against life, that you have been in hiding while claiming to be in search, that you have been running while appearing to sit still. This admission is agonizing. It feels like death, and in a sense it is. It is the death of the spiritual ego, the false self that has been constructed through years of practice and belief. But this death is necessary. It is the negredo of the alchemists, the blackening, the putrefaction that must occur before any genuine transformation. And here is what happens in this process. As you admit these truths, as you allow the shadow to speak, you discover something unexpected. The shadow is not the monster you feared. It is, in fact, the most human part of you, the part that has been waiting, patient and powerful, for the moment when you would finally turn toward it, with honesty rather than judgment. Your anger, once acknowledged, reveals itself not as a spiritual failing, but as a legitimate response to boundaries violated, needs unmet, truths unspoken. It carries information. It has energy that, when not repressed, can be channeled into healthy assertion and creative force. Your desire, once accepted, shows itself not as an obstacle to enlightenment, but as life force itself, the eros that connects you to the world, to others, to the full embodied experience of being alive. It is not something to be transcended, but something to be honored, expressed consciously, integrated into a mature understanding of what it means to be a sexual, passionate, desiring being. Your ego, once seen clearly, turns out not to be the enemy, but a necessary structure of the psyche, a mechanism for navigating reality, making choices, maintaining boundaries. The problem was never the ego itself, but the inflation of the ego or the premature attempt to dissolve it before it had been properly developed. A healthy ego, far from being unspiritual, is the prerequisite for genuine spiritual development. You cannot transcend something you have never properly developed. This is the great discovery of the descent. The shadow contains not only what is dark and dangerous, but also what is powerful, creative, and essential. It contains the very qualities that a premature spirituality tried to banish: assertiveness, healthy selfishness, appropriate anger, passionate desire, ambition, pride, the capacity for strategic thinking, and worldly effectiveness. These are not unspiritual. They are necessary. They are part of wholeness. And this is where many spiritual teachings have failed us. They have presented a model of enlightenment that is essentially disembodied, unworldly, passive. The ideal spiritual person is always calm, always accepting, never pushing back, never asserting needs, never engaging with the messy realities of power and conflict and desire that characterize actual human life. This ideal is not wisdom, it is dissociation. It is the attempt to solve the problem of being human by ceasing to be fully human. True spiritual maturity, by contrast, includes the full range of human capacities. It is consciousness plus competence. It is wisdom plus effectiveness. It is compassion plus boundaries. It is transcendence plus embodiment. It is the integration of the shadow not through its destruction, but through its recognition as a necessary part of the whole. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like. Imagine a spiritual teacher, let's call her Maya, who has built her entire identity on being loving, accepting, and non-judgmental. She runs a meditation community where everyone is welcome, where harsh words are never spoken, where conflict is immediately smoothed over with spiritual platitudes about unity and compassion. Maya is beloved. People praise her gentleness, her wisdom, her open heart. But beneath this surface, there is a problem. Maya has a shadow, a vast reservoir of unexpressed anger, unacknowledged judgments, and repressed boundaries. She says yes when she means no. She allows behaviors that violate her values because confronting them would mean appearing unspiritual. She subtly manipulates people through her sweetness, getting her needs met indirectly because she cannot assert them directly. And when someone does cross a line she cannot ignore, she does not confront them openly, but instead spreads concerns about them behind their back, always framed as worry for their spiritual welfare. Her community, despite its ideals, becomes toxic, a place where resentments simmer beneath forced smiles, where cliques form based on proximity to Maya, where people are afraid to speak honestly because any conflict is immediately labeled as ego or lack of consciousness. This continues until the crisis point. Perhaps a senior member of the community finally confronts Maya about her leadership. Perhaps a scandal erupts involving financial impropriety or inappropriate relationships. Perhaps Maya herself has a breakdown, the weight of her unfelt anger finally becoming unbearable. Whatever the trigger, the structure collapses. The community fractures. Maya is forced to face her shadow. Now imagine Maya chooses the third path, the path of descent. She enters therapy. She stops performing spiritual teacher and allows herself to simply be a human being who is struggling. She explores her childhood, the origins of her pattern of people-pleasing and indirect communication. She allows herself to feel the anger she has been repressing for decades. She learns, slowly and painfully, to set boundaries, to say no, to express disagreement, to tolerate the discomfort of being disliked. What emerges is a different kind of teacher, one who is less perfect but more real, one who speaks about both love and boundaries, both compassion and discernment, both acceptance and the necessity of saying no, one who models not the transcendence of the shadow, but its integration. Her community, if she rebuilds one, is healthier, not because it has more light, but because it has more truth, more room for the full range of human experience, more honesty about the difficulties of the path. This is what shadow integration looks like in the context of spirituality. It is not a betrayal of the spiritual path, but its fulfillment. It is the movement from transcendence to integration, from perfection to wholeness, from the attempt to be only light to the acceptance of being both light and shadow in conscious relationship with all aspects of self. But this process is not only individual. There is a collective shadow in spirituality that must also be addressed, and this is where the conflict intensifies, where the stakes become not just personal, but cultural, not just psychological, but societal. Consider the ways that modern spirituality has been co-opted by capitalism, commodified into a product that can be bought and sold. Meditation apps, wellness retreats, crystal shops, yoga clothing brands. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of these, but what happens when spirituality becomes primarily a market? When its value is measured not by the depth of transformation it facilitates, but by the number of subscribers, followers, likes? What happens is the shadow side of capitalism infects spirituality, competition disguised as community, performance disguised as practice, image cultivation disguised as inner work. The spiritual marketplace rewards what sells, what is marketable, what is easily consumable. It does not reward depth, challenge, or genuine transformation. These are hard to package, hard to sell, hard to scale. And so we get a spirituality of surfaces, a spirituality that promises everything will be easy, that you can manifest your dreams, that if you just vibrate at the right frequency, you can avoid all suffering. This is not wisdom. It is toxic positivity. It is the collective shadow of a culture that cannot tolerate difficulty, that sees any problem as a sign of personal failure, that has pathologized normal human struggles and repackaged them as spiritual deficits to be overcome through purchase of the right program, the right practice, the right product. This creates what we might call the spirituality of privilege, a spirituality that is only accessible to those who already have basic needs met, who have the time and money to attend retreats and workshops, who live in circumstances where meditation and yoga and conscious manifesting are viable paths. For those in genuine crisis, those facing systemic oppression, economic precarity, acute trauma, this spirituality offers nothing but another layer of shame, another message that their suffering is their own fault, another indication that they are not vibrating high enough, not manifesting correctly, not spiritually evolved enough to create the life they desire. The collective shadow here is the avoidance of systemic analysis, the reduction of all problems to individual consciousness, the refusal to acknowledge that some difficulties are not personal lessons but results of unjust structures. A truly integrated spirituality would include both inner work and engagement with the world, both personal transformation and collective action, both consciousness and ethics. But the shadow side of modern spirituality often reduces everything to the personal, leaving the structures of power unchallenged and intact. And then there is perhaps the deepest collective shadow, the use of spirituality to bypass death itself. Notice how much of modern spirituality is oriented toward transcendence, leaving the body, accessing higher realms, identifying with pure consciousness rather than with the mortal, limited, finite self. This is, at its core, a refusal to be mortal, an attempt to solve the problem of death through psychological and spiritual techniques. But death cannot be bypassed. It can only be accepted, and a spirituality built on the denial of death, no matter how sophisticated its language, is a spirituality with a profound shadow. It creates seekers who are always oriented toward the next level, the next dimension, the next evolution of consciousness, never fully landing in this life, this body, this moment, with all its beauty and tragedy and inescapable limitation. The great spiritual traditions, in their original forms, understood this. They did not promise escape from death, but a way to live fully while mortal, to embrace the cycle of birth and death and rebirth as sacred, to find meaning not through transcendence but through participation. But this wisdom has been lost in modern spirituality's obsession with ascending, with evolving, with becoming more than human. Here is the shadow. In our quest to be spiritual, we have forgotten how to be mortal. In our pursuit of enlightenment, we have lost the art of living. In our attempts to transcend the darkness, we have rejected the earth, the body, the finite human experience that is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And so the conflict intensifies. The shadow grows, the basement fills, and we are brought again and again to the moment of choice. Will we continue the pattern of repression and transcendence? Will we abandon spirituality entirely in our disillusionment? Or will we finally choose the path of descent, of integration, of embracing both light and shadow in the service of wholeness? This is the crisis we face, individually and collectively. This is the shadow side of spirituality revealed in all its power and complexity. And now we must ask, is there a way through? Is there a resolution that does not require us to abandon spirituality, but also does not allow us to continue in our sophisticated avoidance of what is dark and difficult and undeniably real? The answer, as we will discover, lies not in more transcendence, but in something far more challenging, in the willingness to descend fully, to integrate completely, to become not enlightened beings floating above human experience, but whole beings who have finally made peace with being human. This is where our journey now takes us, into the revelation, the awakening, the discovery of what lies on the other side of the shadow's embrace. There is a moment, after the long descent, after the crisis of the shadow's return, after the painful shattering of spiritual certainty, a moment when something new becomes possible, not a return to the old spirituality, not a rejection of the path, but a transformation into something deeper, more real, more integrated. This is the moment when we discover that the shadow was never the enemy. It was the teacher we refused to acknowledge, the guide we rejected, the wisdom we deemed too dark to be sacred. Let me tell you what integration actually means, because this word has been thrown around so carelessly in spiritual circles that it has lost its power, its precision, its genuine transformative potential. Integration is not the elimination of the shadow. It is not the conquest of darkness by light. It is not even the balance of opposites, as if light and shadow could be measured out in equal portions and combined into some neutral grey. Integration is the recognition that light and shadow are not opposites but complementarities, not enemies but partners in the dance of consciousness. Integration is the moment when we stop trying to be only one thing and allow ourselves to be complex, contradictory, paradoxical, fully human in a way that honors both our capacity for transcendence and our rootedness in the messy, mortal, limited human experience. Carl Jung devoted his life to this understanding. He wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." Notice the radicalism of this statement. Jung is saying that the pursuit of goodness, of spiritual purity, of being only light is actually the obstacle to genuine psychological and spiritual maturity. Wholeness, the integration of all aspects of self, including those deemed unacceptable, is the true goal. This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the spiritual path. Instead of a ladder ascending toward enlightenment, imagine a mandala, a circle that includes everything, where each quality and its opposite are both necessary parts of the whole. In this understanding, anger is not the opposite of compassion, but its necessary complement. Without the capacity for healthy anger, compassion becomes enabling, codependence disguised as care. True compassion includes fierce boundaries, the willingness to say no, the energy to confront what is harmful. Desire is not the opposite of contentment, but its partner. A person who has truly accepted desire, who has allowed themselves to want and to pursue what they want, discovers a form of contentment that is not based on the numbing of desire, but on its full expression and eventual natural satisfaction. The contentment that comes from repression is false. It is resignation disguised as peace. True contentment includes the full aliveness of wanting. The ego is not the opposite of enlightenment, but its foundation. A person must have a functional, healthy ego before they can transcend it. The spiritual teachings about egolessness were never meant for people who have not yet developed a coherent sense of self. They were meant as advanced practices for those who had already achieved psychological maturity. When egoless teachings are given to people with underdeveloped egos, the result is not enlightenment, but spiritual bypassing, dissociation, and the creation of a fragile, false self that collapses under pressure. This is the revelation. The path to genuine spiritual awakening runs through psychological maturity, not around it. The path to wholeness includes shadow work, not as preparation for spiritual practice, but as spiritual practice itself. The descent into the basement is not a detour from the spiritual path, it is the path. And here is what this looks like in practice. It looks like a practitioner who can sit in meditation and access states of profound peace, and also who can feel and express the full range of human emotions when those emotions arise. Who does not use meditation to bypass feelings, but as a practice for developing the capacity to be with all experiences, pleasant and unpleasant, without being overwhelmed or identified. It looks like a teacher who is transparent about their own ongoing struggles, who does not present themselves as having arrived, but as being on the journey, who models not perfection, but honest engagement with difficulty, who sets clear boundaries and acknowledges their limitations and admits when they have made mistakes, not as spiritual theater, but as genuine authenticity. It looks like a community that has explicit agreements about how to handle conflict, that makes space for difficult conversations, that does not spiritualize or suppress disagreements, but works through them with psychological sophistication and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. Where being spiritual does not mean being nice, but being real. It looks like a spirituality that includes therapy, that sees psychological healing and spiritual development as complementary rather than competing paths, that understands that trauma must be processed before transcendence is possible, that respects the slow, difficult work of emotional maturation as sacred work. It looks like a practice that is both transcendent and embodied, that includes both meditation and dance, both contemplation and action in the world, both the pursuit of higher states and the full embrace of earthly existence, not as compromise, but as integration. This integrated approach has ancient roots, though they have often been obscured. In the yogic tradition, the path was never only about transcendence, but about the integration of spirit and matter, symbolized by the marriage of Shiva and Shakti, consciousness and energy, transcendence and embodiment. In the Buddhist tradition, the ideal was not the arhat who escapes the world, but the bodhisattva who returns to it, who integrates enlightenment with compassion, who achieves liberation, and then commits to helping others do the same. In the Christian mystical tradition, the path included both the ascent to union with God and the descent back into the world. Christ on the cross, fully human and fully divine, integrating heaven and earth. But these integrative wisdoms were often lost in the transmission of these traditions to the modern West. We extracted the transcendent elements and left behind the embodied ones. We took the meditation, but not the community ethics. We took the enlightenment stories, but not the decades of ordinary practice that preceded them. We took the peak experiences, but not the daily discipline of integration. And so we must recover this wisdom, not by returning to some idealized past, but by moving forward into a spirituality that is appropriate for our time, our culture, our contemporary understanding of psychology and consciousness. What would such a spirituality look like? Let me describe it in concrete terms. First, it would begin with trauma-informed practice. Instead of immediately prescribing meditation or spiritual practices, it would first assess whether a person has the psychological resources to benefit from such practices. For someone with significant unprocessed trauma, meditation can be re-traumatizing. It can bring up overwhelming feelings without the capacity to process them. A trauma-informed approach would begin with body-based therapies, with the development of resources and coping skills. with the establishment of safety and stabilization before any transcendent practices are introduced. Second, it would include education about shadow work as a necessary component of spiritual development. Every spiritual practitioner would be taught to recognize projection, to work with their shadow through journaling, therapy, or shadow dialoguing techniques. They would understand that any quality they strongly judge in others is likely a disowned part of themselves. They would be encouraged to explore their dreams, to pay attention to what triggers them emotionally, to investigate the gap between their spiritual ideals and their actual behavior. Third, it would make psychological therapy not a sign of spiritual failure, but a recognized part of the path. The spiritual community would maintain relationships with therapists and would refer people appropriately. There would be no shame in admitting to psychological difficulties, no pressure to have transcended issues that actually require professional help. In fact, engaging in therapy would be seen as a sign of spiritual maturity, the willingness to do the difficult work of healing rather than bypassing it. Fourth, it would include collective practices for shadow work, not just individual ones. The community would create structures for honest feedback, for conflict resolution, for addressing power dynamics and unconscious biases. There would be regular check-ins about the health of the community, willingness to address problems directly rather than spiritual bypassing them. The shadow of the collective would be acknowledged and worked with as deliberately as the shadow of the individual. Fifth, it would balance transcendent practices with embodied ones. For every hour of meditation, there might be practices of dance, of martial arts, of sensory engagement, of sexuality understood as sacred, of eating and walking and being in the body as spiritual practice. The goal would not be to escape the body, but to be fully in it, conscious and alive. Sixth, it would include ethical engagement with the world. A truly integrated spirituality cannot remain apolitical or solely focused on individual transformation. It must address systemic injustice, environmental crisis, the collective shadows of racism, sexism, economic exploitation. The spiritual practitioner is not separate from the world, but intimately connected to it, and their practice must include both inner work and outer action. Seventh, it would be transparent about the fact that enlightenment, as it is often presented, may not be a stable state, but a series of openings and closings, insights and forgettings, transcendent experiences and returns to ordinary consciousness. Instead of the narrative of linear progress toward a permanent awakening, it would acknowledge the spiral nature of the path, the way we work with the same issues at deeper levels, the way insight does not eliminate problems but changes our relationship to them. Eighth, it would honor death not as something to be transcended, but as the great teacher. Practices would include meditation on mortality, contemplation of impermanence, rituals that acknowledge loss and grief. The spiritual path would be understood not as escape from death, but as learning to live fully while mortal, to find meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to love despite loss. This is what an integrated spirituality might look like. And here is what it would produce. Not perfect beings of light who have transcended the human condition, but whole human beings who have integrated their shadows, who can be both spiritual and psychological, both transcendent and embodied, both wise and appropriately human. These integrated practitioners would be recognizable not by their spiritual performance, but by their presence. They would have depth rather than polish. They would be comfortable with paradox, able to hold complexity without collapsing into simplistic certainties. They would have boundaries but also openness. They would be capable of profound states of consciousness and also of dealing effectively with practical realities. They would be compassionate but not enabling, wise but not know-it-all, confident but not arrogant. Most importantly, they would be authentic. The gap between their spiritual ideal and their actual behavior would be small, not because they had perfected themselves, but because their ideals had become realistic, rooted in actual possibility rather than fantasy. They would not be trying to be someone else, but would be fully themselves, with all their quirks and limitations and humanness, and this very authenticity would be their spiritual teaching. Let me give you an example of what this integration looks like in a real life. Meet James, a meditation teacher in his 50s, who has been practicing for 30 years. For most of those years, James presented himself as a model of equanimity and non-attachment. He taught with quiet authority, never raising his voice, always seeming to exist in a state of serene detachment. Students revered him. He was considered deeply awakened. But beneath this surface, James was suffering. His marriage was failing because his wife felt he was emotionally unavailable. His children barely knew him because he was always in practice. He had chronic health issues he ignored, believing that if he just meditated more, his body would heal. And he had a secret, an addiction to pornography that he felt crushing shame about but could not stop, an addiction that revealed the gulf between his spiritual image and his actual inner experience. The crisis came when his wife left him and his oldest child stopped speaking to him. James could no longer maintain the fiction of his enlightenment. He fell apart. And in falling apart, he finally became available for genuine transformation. James entered therapy. He joined a men's group where he could be honest about his struggles. He began to explore the roots of his emotional unavailability, tracing them back to childhood trauma he had never processed. He worked with his addiction not as a spiritual failure but as a symptom of deeper wounds that needed healing. He learned to feel and express emotions he had been repressing for decades. He rebuilt relationships with his children, showing up not as a spiritual teacher, but as a flawed human being trying to do better. What emerged was a different teacher. James still taught meditation, but he also talked openly about his struggles, about the limits of spiritual practice, about the necessity of psychological work. He taught with more humility and more humor. He modeled not perfection, but integration, the willingness to include all aspects of human experience in his practice and teaching. His students, initially shocked by his vulnerability, eventually found his new approach far more helpful than his previous spiritual performance. Because now they could see themselves in him. Now they had permission to be human while on the spiritual path. This is what the integration of shadow and light produces. Not flawless beings, but honest ones. Not perfect teachers, but authentic guides. Not communities without problems, but communities willing to work with their problems consciously and courageously. And this is what the future of spirituality must include, if it is to remain relevant, if it is to actually serve the transformation of consciousness rather than becoming another mechanism of avoidance and repression. We are at a unique moment in human history. We have access to both the ancient wisdom traditions and contemporary psychology. We have thousands of years of spiritual teachings and also neuroscience, trauma research, developmental psychology. We can, if we choose, create a synthesis that honors both transcendence and embodiment, both awakening and healing, both the spiritual and the psychological. But this will require courage. It will require letting go of simplistic narratives about enlightenment. It will require acknowledging that our spiritual heroes were human, flawed, often unconscious in ways they never addressed. It will require creating new forms and structures that support integration rather than repression. It will require each practitioner to do the difficult work of shadow integration again and again, at deeper and deeper levels, for the rest of their lives. Because here is the final truth about the shadow side of spirituality. It never goes away. Integration is not a destination, but a practice, an ongoing commitment to wholeness, a daily choice to include rather than exclude, to see rather than avoid, to be with all of who we are rather than trying to become only who we think we should be. The awakening, then, is not the end of the shadow, but the beginning of a conscious relationship with it. It is the shift from unconscious repression to conscious integration, from spiritual performance to genuine authenticity, from the fantasy of perfection to the reality of wholeness. This is the revelation at the heart of the descent. This is what we discover in the basement beneath the temple. Not a monster to be slain, but a part of ourselves that has been waiting patiently and powerfully for the moment when we would finally be ready to meet it with open eyes and an open heart. And when we do, when we finally embrace the shadow as part of the sacred whole, something miraculous happens. We become free, not free from the shadow, but free through its integration, free to be fully human, free to make mistakes and learn from them, free to have emotions without being overwhelmed by them, free to want without being controlled by desire, free to have an ego without being imprisoned by it. This is the paradoxical discovery. In accepting our darkness, we find our genuine light. In embracing our limits, we discover our true power. In becoming fully human, we finally touch the divine, not as something separate from us, but as the deepest truth of what we are and always have been. This is the integration of shadow and light. This is the genuine awakening. This is the spiritual path that leads not away from life, but into its very heart. So we have descended together. We have walked down the stairs beneath the temple of light. We have met the shadow that lives in the basement of every spiritual seeking. We have seen how the very pursuit of enlightenment can create new forms of darkness, how the attempt to be only light casts the deepest shadows, how spirituality itself can become a mechanism for avoiding the very wholeness it claims to seek. And now, having descended, having seen, having integrated what we found in the darkness, we can begin to build differently, not temples without basements, but structures where the basement is acknowledged, where the shadow is given its place, where wholeness rather than perfection is the goal. This is not a pessimistic conclusion, it is a realistic one. And in its realism, there is tremendous hope. Because once we stop demanding that spirituality make us perfect, we can finally discover what it actually offers, the possibility of being whole. Wholeness includes everything: your anger and your compassion, your desire and your contentment, your ego and your capacity for selflessness, your wounds and your wisdom, your darkness and your light. All of it belongs. All of it is sacred when held in consciousness, when integrated rather than repressed, when seen as part of the complete human experience rather than divided into spiritual and unspiritual, acceptable and unacceptable, light and shadow. The spiritual teachers we need now are not those who claim to have transcended their humanity, but those who have learned to be fully human with consciousness, with compassion for themselves and others, with honesty about their struggles and limitations. They are the ones who will say, "I am still learning. I am still making mistakes. I am still discovering aspects of myself I did not know were there." And this is the path, not perfection, but ongoing discovery, ongoing integration, ongoing commitment to wholeness. The spiritual communities we need are not those that enforce conformity to an ideal, but those that make space for the full range of human experience, that address conflict directly, that work with shadow collectively, that integrate psychological understanding with spiritual practice, that honor both transcendence and embodiment, both inner work and engagement with the world. The spiritual practices we need are not only those that take us into altered states, but those that help us integrate those states into ordinary life, that build our capacity to be with all experiences, that strengthen rather than bypass the ego before attempting to transcend it, that include body and emotion and relationship as legitimate domains of spiritual development. And the spiritual understanding we need is not one of linear progress toward a permanent enlightenment, but of a spiral path where we work with the same issues at deeper levels, where insight and forgetting both have their place, where awakening is not a destination, but a quality of presence we can cultivate in each moment, knowing that we will also lose it, and that this losing is part of the process. This is a spirituality that can actually help us navigate the challenges of being human in a complex, often painful, always finite existence. This is a spirituality that does not promise escape, but offers companionship on the journey. This is a spirituality rooted not in fantasy, but in reality. In the reality of who we actually are, with all our contradictions and complications, and capacity for both profound wisdom and spectacular unconsciousness. And here is what this spirituality reveals: that the sacred is not only in the transcendent, but in the immanent, not only in heaven but on earth, not only in light but in darkness, not only in perfection but in imperfection, not only in the eternal but in the mortal. Every moment of your life is sacred, not because you are always enlightened, but because you are always here, alive, conscious, participating in the great mystery of existence. Every emotion you feel is sacred, not because it is pleasant or spiritual, but because it is real. It is yours. It is part of the full spectrum of human experience. Every relationship you navigate is sacred, not because it is always harmonious, but because it is the crucible in which you are continually transformed. Every challenge you face is sacred, not because it is a lesson designed by the universe, but because it is an opportunity to meet life with consciousness, with courage, with the fullness of who you are. This is the spirituality on the other side of the shadow's integration. This is what we discover when we finally stop trying to escape our humanity and instead embrace it fully, consciously, with compassion for ourselves and others who are on this same impossible, beautiful, tragic, joyful journey. The temple we rebuild is not taller or more radiant than the one that fell. It is simply more honest. It has a basement, and we know it. We go down there regularly. We meet what lives in the darkness. We bring it into consciousness. We integrate it into the whole. And because we do this work, because we are willing to descend, the temple actually becomes stronger, more stable, built on a foundation of honesty rather than repression. This is your invitation, not to transcend your shadow, but to turn toward it. Not to become enlightened, but to become whole. Not to escape your humanity, but to embrace it so fully, so consciously, that your very presence becomes a teaching, a reminder that it is possible to be both spiritual and psychological, both wise and flawed, both awakened and always awakening. The journey does not end. The shadow does not disappear. The work of integration continues for as long as we are alive. But in this continuation, in this ongoing practice of bringing consciousness to what was unconscious, light to what was dark, acceptance to what was rejected, in this lies the genuine spiritual path. So go down into your basement, meet what lives there, bring it into the light of consciousness, not to destroy it, but to see it, to know it, to integrate it into your understanding of who you are. Do this with courage and with compassion. Do this knowing that this is not a detour from spirituality, but its very essence. Do this knowing that every seeker who has truly awakened has walked this path before you, descending into their own shadows, facing what they found there, and emerging not perfect but whole. And then, having done this work, having integrated your shadow, rebuild your temple, build it on solid ground, build it with a basement that is acknowledged and utilized. Build it with the understanding that genuine spirituality includes everything, the light and the dark, the transcendent and the mundane, the perfect and the broken, the eternal and the mortal. Build it with the knowledge that you are not here to escape life, but to live it fully, consciously, courageously, with all your humanity intact and integrated into your spirituality. This is the shadow side of spirituality revealed and integrated. This is the descent that makes genuine ascension possible. This is the path of wholeness. And as you walk this path, remember, the basement was never a prison. It was a treasure house. The shadow was never the enemy. It was the guide you refused to acknowledge. And the darkness you feared was simply the unlit portion of your own sacred nature, waiting patiently for the moment when you would finally be ready to bring consciousness to what had been unconscious, acceptance to what had been rejected, and love to what had been judged unworthy of love. May your descent be courageous. May your integration be complete. May your wholeness be the light that guides others into the honest embrace of their own shadows. And may we all build temples strong enough to hold both the light and the darkness, knowing that in their integration lies the only genuine enlightenment worth pursuing. The journey into shadow is the journey into truth, and truth, however dark it may sometimes appear, is always sacred. Welcome to the descent. Welcome to the shadow. Welcome to the difficult, beautiful, necessary work of becoming whole. This is Echoes of the Ancients. Until we meet again in the depths.